Today we're going to be talking about things you should consider before actually going and getting a bird. Even the smallest little birds, like my tiny little parrotlet Mia, can be very time consuming and very difficult to care for if you aren't properly prepared for your bird before you bring them home. So in this video we're going to discuss some of the things that aren't commonly thought about when it comes to bringing a bird home, and kind of the aspects of taking care of parrots that can actually deter you from wanting to have them in the first place. When you're bringing home a little bird for the first time, the way that you take care of them is very different than you take care of a dog and a cat. And the main reason for this is that they aren't domesticated. Parrots are not a domesticated species. They haven't been bred in captivity for long enough. They don't serve a purpose to humanity. They are not considered a domesticated species. They're still very much exotic. And there's a lot of things about that when it comes down from their behavior to their medical care to their everyday lives with us that makes them so much more difficult to care for and have many different challenges than you would when it comes to a domesticated species like pigeons or a dog or a cat. One of the most common things that tends to be difficult about taking care of a parrot in a captive environment is their medical care. Parrots cannot go see your average vet, they can't go see your dog's vet, they need a specialized avian vet. An avian vet is not an exotics vet that treats reptiles and amphibians. An avian vet is one that specializes in parrots. Parrots, down to their physiology, are extremely different than mammals and reptiles. Parrots have completely differently structured blood cells, and they're so sensitive that if you aren't properly trained on how to do things and you don't keep yourself up to date on common medicine for them, you can accidentally end up damaging them quite severely. When it comes to really tiny birds, like my parrotlet Mia here, they sometimes can't have proper medical procedures done for them because they're so tiny. Because of the way modern medicine is, or Western medicine is, I guess, the amount of blood they have to take to actually get those tests is so much in comparison to the size of Mia's body that the amount of stress it would put on her body could do more harm than good. As if just getting them their exams and getting them through the exams wasn't hard enough, actually finding an avian vet is the more difficult part. The only website I know of that actually tells you whether or not a vet is certified to treat parrots properly is AAV.org, and that is the Association of Avian Veterinarians. And there you'll find a list where you can search by your location and they will tell you where your next nearest vet is. Where I live in Canada, there's only one vet in my city, actually in my entire province I think, that is certified to treat parrots. There's actually two. One of them works for the zoo and the other one works for a local vet. There's only one person that I can actually take my birds to treat them properly. So before you even think about getting a bird, you need to think about whether or not you can get them the care they need. Behavior problems. So parrots are an exotic species. They're not domesticated. They have no desire to want to work with you unless you create that desire to be there. Because of this, you can end up with a lot of behavioral problems that can either arise simply because it's their natural instinct to behave that way, and they aren't adapted to living in a captive environment yet because they haven't lived here long enough, or because they're very sensitive animals, and being in a captive environment with someone who's a little less experienced with their behavior, you can have a lot of bad behavioral problems come up because that's the way the animal would naturally respond to the way that we're dealing with them. And if you don't know how to train properly, and you don't know how to utilize your reinforcements, and you don't understand their body language and their behavioral history, then you're going to run into a lot of problems and you could end up with a very aggressive bird. One of the worst stages for almost every single parrot is called the terrible twos. That's what is commonly referred to. And basically what the terrible twos are is when your bird turns 2 years old, most species turn 2 years old, you will end up experiencing parrot puberty, where they start to develop all of their hormones, they start having incredible hormonal imbalances, and they start shifting from being kind of a child to being an adult. This stage is when most parrots end up getting rehomed. Whether you're getting a budgie or a macaw, they all go through this stage where they start out as this really sweet, cuddly, tiny bird who is very dependent on you. Because they're young, because they need you to learn, during that first year of their life, they tend to be a lot more sweet and cuddly and a lot more dependent on human contact for you to be able to teach them how to get through life. When that bird turns 2, they start turning into an adult, and they don't want to be manhandled anymore, they don't like being excessively touched, they start developing boundaries that they may not have had previously, and when they set these boundaries all of a sudden, the people handling them don't really understand what's going on. They just have a bird who's gone from being very dependent and wanting all that handling to no longer wanting it anymore and starting to set these boundaries. And it starts with the bird giving you body language saying, ooh, I'm uncomfortable, I don't like that. But because it's your bird, you've had it for a year, it's been fine with this handling for all this time, you don't really acknowledge those behaviors and you start to ignore them. And the more you ignore those behaviors, the more you ignore those little body language tics that are telling you they're uncomfortable, the bird will flip and they will bite you. The average person's response to being bitten is to get mad at the animal that has bitten them, lash out, spray it with a bottle, shake your hand, and create a negative association. And unfortunately, that ends up sort of reinforcing the whole situation. The bird got angry, you got angry back, and now you've just got this really negative, angry situation where the behavior isn't going to change, your behavior isn't going to change, and it just festers and grows into this horrific situation where you're both just mad at each other constantly because you don't understand the behavior, you don't know how to handle it, and the bird is just responding to the anger that you're showing them by being angry back because they're trying to defend themselves at this point. It's really unfortunate when things turn out that way, but unfortunately the average person doesn't understand applied behavioral analysis and doesn't have the background to know where those behaviors stem from and how to handle them, largely because we just don't prepare enough when we first get animals. We just think they're cute, we grab them and bring them home, and then the problems start arising, and then we research into it. And by that point, you've already done some negative things, you've already accidentally reinforced the wrong behaviors and made the problems worse. So now instead of just preventing everything in the first place, you're having to try and fix something, and that is millions of times worse than just preventing it from happening. And of course, parrots can experience many more behavior problems than just what they start to experience when they go through the age of 2. They can experience things from plucking, they can experience toe tapping, toe tugging, attention screaming, one-person aggression. There's so many things that are very unique to parrots that people don't prepare for and don't set up for properly. A lot of the behaviors can be prevented just from knowing that they can happen and preparing yourself accordingly. But if you don't know that those behaviors happen, you really don't know how to prepare for them. Plucking is one of those behaviors that we still don't really understand. Plucking is a behavior that is exclusive to living in captivity and is one of the many reasons why parrots really aren't suited to living in a captive environment. Plucking can happen for any number of reasons, even to birds that live in the best of care. Plucking can be caused for medical reasons, it can be caused because of nutrition, it can be caused because you yelled at them one day and they're stressed out. There's a lot of reasons why plucking can occur, and sometimes once it starts, it just becomes a habit and the bird can't stop even after the causing factor has been eliminated. So it's one of those things that you really want to prevent before it happens, because if your bird starts plucking, every time they pull out a feather, it does kind of release those happy chemicals that relieve kind of stress and anxiety and tell them that they're calm and happy. And it kind of becomes addicting in a sense where they just keep doing it to kind of relieve that sensation. So it becomes very difficult to manage once they've actually started doing the behavior if it goes on for too long. My next favorite behavior problem is probably attention screaming, and this one happens a lot. So how attention screaming starts is usually you have a bird or a new bird, you just brought them home, and maybe they're new to the environment, they aren't comfortable playing yet, but they've found some degree of trust in you and engagement and interest in you. So if you end up with a bird who hasn't been taught how to play, or maybe doesn't have enough enrichment, or hasn't been shown how to properly use their enrichment, you can have a bird that sits in their cage and be really dependent on your interactions for enjoyment. So the bird doesn't know how to entertain itself and will go to you to be entertained instead. And then when you leave, the bird will scream to make you come back. And what can happen is usually the first time the parrot screams, you panic a little bit and you're like, oh no, what's wrong? And you run back in to check in, like, oh, did something spook them by the window? Or are they stuck? Are they hurt? You coming back in the room has now reinforced that when they scream, you're going to show up. And they start to kind of gain that understanding, and they'll start to scream to make you show up until it hits a point where the bird can scream for hours straight because they know eventually your interaction is going to come. That's another one of those problems where it can get really out of hand really fast if you don't understand what's happening the first time it arises. Because the more a behavior starts to get reinforced and the more that bad habit develops, the harder it's going to be to undo it than it would be just to prevent it in the first place. While we're on the topic of social requirements, parrots in general tend to be pretty social birds. There are some birds, such as parrotlets and lovebirds, that do not require secondary birds to be happy. There are a lot of species that only live with a second bird. They maybe live in groups of 6 to 8, and they don't really like being around a lot of other birds. It can create a lot of stress, they can be excessively territorial, and that's just the way that species is. But every bird does have some degree of social needs that need to be met, and some have significantly more social needs than others. And cockatiels and budgies are some really socially needy birds. Cockatoos are massively social birds that need a lot of time, either with you or with another bird. Now, the average person is going to work for 8 hours a day, or you're going to school for 8 hours a day. So you don't have a whole lot of time. Parrots are so needy, and if you don't meet those needs, they can get really stressed out, they can get really upset, they can start plucking their feathers. Because parrots do have a limbic system, they do experience emotions. If your bird is left alone and their social needs aren't met, they can get sad, they can feel lonely as far as we know at this point, and it does tend to affect them, and they usually present that as plucking behaviors or other undesirable behaviors. I don't like to have a bird if I know I can't spend more than 4 hours with them a day. I like to do 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening. That is the bare minimum for me personally. I know a lot of websites say that the minimum is 1 hour. It's not a lot of time, especially when you're a type of animal that thrives off of that social need. Not being able to fulfill that does have a very drastic impact on their health, and can end up with a bird that starts getting really aggressive, starts screaming a lot, starts ripping out their feathers, just because of that one simple thing that hasn't been properly fulfilled. The last thing that most people don't know about until after they get a bird is how many things can actually hurt them. When you're thinking about getting a new bird, you're thinking about the cage that you need, how much it costs to set them up. You might be thinking about vet care. You aren't generally thinking about your frying pans and your candle collection. So parrots are very, very sensitive. They have a very unique respiratory system that is extremely efficient. And because of that, they end up absorbing every single little toxin in the air into their bloodstream. So things like non-stick pans emit a chemical called Teflon, and it actually bursts the capillaries in their lungs when they breathe in too much of it. And non-stick pans are expensive. It's not cheap to go and replace your cookware. It's not cheap to go make sure that your furnace isn't running something toxic. Parrots are so delicate to all these little things that you can go from having a bird that's been totally fine to all of a sudden a bird who is collapsed on the ground struggling to breathe because their lungs are filling with fluid because you were cooking something in the kitchen and didn't realize that your pan had PDFE or PFOA fumes emitting from your pan. There's a lot of household toxins that can kill your bird in a matter of minutes. So prior to getting a bird, I would definitely make sure to go look up some toxic lists of things. You'll find things like air fresheners, bags of microwave popcorn, non-stick pans, colognes, even bath bombs. The last thing to consider, which is a very common one to consider, is their lifespan. Birds live for a very long time. Budgies can actually live for 20 years. Mia here can live for 25 years. Newt can live for 30, 35 years. There's a lot of life to have in these tiny little bodies. And 30 years is a long time. It really is. And you need to be able to care for them for the entire life that they're there. When you bring an animal into your house, it's your responsibility to take care of it for as long as you feasibly can. And if you're getting a bird and let's say you're in high school, 30 years from now, where are you going to be? You're going to have a job, you might have a family, you might have a house. There's so many things that can randomly go wrong. There's so many things that can change that you can't predict. And when you're considering bringing a new animal into your life, you're kind of making a promise to them that you're going to be able to take care of them forever. Lifespan is a lot larger than most people think, even for small birds. You know, budgies can live for 20 years, Mia can live for 25. It's a crazy amount of time for something so small to exist, but we kind of owe it to them to take care of them for all the time that they're going to be here for. The last thing I'm going to mention that tends to be one of the more commonly noted ones is volume. Parrots can get very, very loud, but people don't actually tend to tell you how loud they can get. So budgies don't tend to be too loud. They sit around the same decibels of you and I talking. They're pretty average, but they do chatter a lot. Budgies are the quietest species of parrot, but they chatter. So yes, in theory, they would be an appropriate bird for an apartment because of their volume, but they might not be the appropriate bird for you because they talk constantly and they don't stop chattering. Little Mia, my tiny little parrotlet, can hit decibels of an upwards of 65 to 70 decibels, which can be the volume of a vacuum cleaner going. Now that's not insanely loud, but if she was to do that constantly, it would probably drive me up the wall. She doesn't vocalize very much, parrotlets don't tend to, but she does have a few chirps that can be quite loud. And if you do have some sensory overload issues, you might find that volume bothersome. When it comes to more common birds, if you've got your conures, little man-day conures that aren't that big can hit decibels of up to 155. Now 155 decibels is the sound of like a jet plane taking off. That is insanely loud, and that is going to be trapped in your house going at absolutely chaotic volumes that will echo off the walls. That is loud, okay? That's not pleasant, that's not fun. That's just to kind of give you a perspective of how the bird doesn't have to necessarily be big to be loud. The Nande conure is actually louder than a macaw. So size does not dictate volume. Lovebirds can get massively louder than parrotlets, even though there's only an inch difference in their size. So volume can play a very big role, especially if you live in apartments or condos and you have regulations over, noise, and you have neighbors that could complain. While volume is a very important factor and is not something that a lot of people realize is actually as loud as it is, it also does drastically depend on the species and how often they make those vocalizations. Because sure, they can hit those absolutely nuts tall volumes that aren't ear piercing, but that doesn't mean that they vocalize that way all the time, and you can train them to let out all the energy and let out all of those volumes during selected hours of the day when their neighbors aren't home. So there are ways to work around it. It just depends on what you're willing to do and how much work you want to put into it. But birds are very, very loud, and it is a common thing that gets complained about. So being prepared for those things and understanding just how loud they can be is a very important factor when deciding whether or not to even get a bird in the first place. So I think that's going to do it for today. I hope that this gave you guys something more to think about. There's a lot of things to look at when it comes to birds and things to consider. If I were to suggest anything, I would say go to goodbird.inc. That is a web page run by an applied behavioral analyst who has gone to schooling, does have certifications, and she works with anything from zoos to pet birds and parrots. She has a lot of knowledge and she has a lot of understanding of their behaviors and weird things that might arise when taking care of a bird for the first time. There's a lot of forums that can also have some really good information. Take a look at them, read other people's experiences, and just gather as much information as you can. Birds can be very difficult to handle, and the more information you can have ahead of time, the better set up you're going to be. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.